Hello everyone, welcome to part 2 of session 4. In this video, we're going to do another Gravette tutorial. Specifically, this tutorial covers 3 important topics. First, it reviews the idea of the grid in visual design. Second, it looks at a couple of examples of grids from the real world so we can practice seeing how grids are employed in authentic contexts. And third, most importantly, it shows us how to build a grid using Gravette Designer. So let's get started. As shown here, any canvas can be divided up in various ways, such as the 3x3 grid you're seeing here. Of course, most of the time, especially when working in print, a margin is necessary. A margin is simply the white space surrounding the content of a page. Now, the main idea of a grid is to establish a structure so that you as the designer can easily organize the graphic elements of your design. To prevent objects from feeling too crowded and to give your design room to breathe, gutters or the space between the columns are often used. Once you have margins, columns, and gutters, natural modules are formed. These modules are the places where you can position your graphic elements. Of course, modules can be combined in any number of ways to create larger spatial zones. So let's practice seeing the grid in a real-world example. Here's yesterday's front page of the New York Times website. Without too much effort, it is pretty easy to see the underlying grid being used by the design. For example, here I've superimposed 5 columns onto the website. With this grid established, we can see how the designers at the New York Times situate some content into single column modules. Other content that is deemed to be more important is placed within 2 column spatial zones. The name of the newspaper is featured prominently near the top in a 3 column module. Here's another example from a magazine. And again, without very much practice, it is pretty easy to see how a grid was used to establish the layout of these 2 pages. Now that we understand the idea behind using grids, we want to show you how to build a grid in Gravette Designer. For project 4, you have to design a tabloid-sized poster that is 11 by 17 inches. I'm showing a mock-up here in landscape orientation. The first thing to do is to decide what you want for a margin. What's shown here is a 1/2 inch margin all the way around the canvas. Now, working within these margins, as the designer, you get to decide what kind of grid you want to use. In other words, how many rows and columns do you want to work with? In this tutorial, we're going to build a 12 by 6 grid. In short, we're going to learn how to add 12 columns and then 6 rows, and then how we combine those columns and rows to form a complete grid, which will give us 72 modules to work with. The real fun begins when we start thinking about how to leverage these modules to create an eye-catching design that is laid out systematically. You may be wondering why we went with a 12 by 6 grid. Well, one reason is how nicely it works with the rule of thirds. The rule of thirds is a design rule of thumb that suggests visual content should be imagined as divided into 9 equal parts, kind of like this. Okay, so now that we've learned about what we're going to build, let's learn how to do it using Gravette Designer. All right, so let's jump right in. So the first thing you can see here, I have 2 pages. I have Grid Final and I have Grid New. And Grid New is literally just a blank infinite canvas. And I have over here Grid Final, so we know exactly the direction that we're going in. So let me shut everything off here for a minute. Our first task is going to be to build some vertical gutters. Gutters are simply the spaces between our columns so that there is some white space. So this is the first thing that we need to build. And then if I shut this off, the other thing you're going to notice, of course, is this nice margin all the way around. So let's go ahead and start building that in Grid New. So I'm going to click on Grid New, and the first thing I'm going to notice is that I have an infinite canvas. So what I need to do here is I am going to go landscape. So I'm going to type in 17 by 11. So that's 17 inches by 11 inches. And what I want to add is a margin of a half an inch. And if I just have this button selected here, equal margins, and I click enter, it's going to apply that systematically all the way around. So our first task is going to be to define our gutters. Now, through a little bit of practical experience, I know that we want gutters that are a certain size. So let's see here. I am going to grab the rectangle tool. I'm going to select the tool, drag and drop like that. Okay, so this is what I'm going to use to build my gutters. So the first thing I want to do is come up here. I'm going to line it up to the very top. And so its Y value should be a half an inch in. And I know that I want the size of this to be 1600ths of an inch. Okay. Now, importantly, the first two of these we are going to make actually need to be half of that size. So what I'm going to do is select this, and I'm just going to hold down my Alt key, click and drag, and I have two of them now. That's excellent. So what I want to do with this one, I'm actually going to make it half of that size. So I'm actually going to make it 800ths of an inch. Literally what that means is it's half of this 1600ths of an inch. So now I'm going to make a copy of this, just drag it out, and I'm going to bring it all the way over to this size. Okay, so you can essentially this is half a gutter. And then I'm going to copy a whole bunch of these. So you can see here, this is column 1, column 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. This is 11, and this is 12. Okay, great. So now that I have all of these, I'm going to drag and drop to select all of them, and I'm going to align them to the top as a group. So they all went up, and what I want them to do is to be lined up right on my margin. And I happen to know that my margin is at the half-inch mark. So instead of adjusting all of these one at a time, I'm going to come over here and I'm going to say Gravette, make the Y position 0.5. Boom, and that's going to drop them all down. And now I'm going to come over to my distribution buttons, and I want to distribute horizontally, and boom, it evenly spaces those out for us. And now let's just double check that we have the right number of columns: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Beautiful. All right, good. Now what I can go ahead and group those if I want to, but let's hold off on that for just a second. So now what we're going to do a lot of work with the guidelines. So I'm going to come up here, View, and I'm going to make sure my rulers are on. By default, my rulers were already on. And how do I know my rulers are already on? Well, I can see them up here, and I can see them up and down here. And I also want to turn on my guidelines. Now, I don't have any guidelines, but I know they're turned on. So my very first guideline is going to fall right here on the left-hand margin. Excellent. Now I'm going to pull out one more guideline, and I'm going to put it all the way over here on the right. So now for each one of these, so I have my left guide and my right guide. So what I need to do, I'm going to zoom in considerably here so I can see each of these. And what we're going to do is for each gutter, we're going to put a guideline for the middle, one for the left, and one for the right. So let's drag a guideline out to the middle, and let's drag one out for the right-hand side, and one for the left. Then I'm going to go to the next. I'm going to drag one to the middle, drag one to the right, and drag one to the left. And I'm going to go ahead and do all of these relatively quickly. Make sure you have each one selected when you drag the guideline, because then it will snap right to its center position and right to its edge. And this really makes it a lot easier. So we can just fast forward through this part while I do this. And I'm going to hold down my pan key, which is the space bar, which helps me navigate quickly. And we're just dragging and dropping lots of guidelines. A little bit tedious, but this is all going to pay off as we move forward. All right, good. So now if I zoom out, this is essentially what I have. And now I can go ahead and group all of these. I'm going to click group. So there's a couple of ways to do that. You can see I did this over here in the layers where I'm holding down the shift key and I'm going to scroll. I've selected the top rectangle. I'm going to hold down the shift key, come all the way down to the bottom. I'm going to right click and I'm going to say group selection. Boom. And now I have everything grouped in one group, and I want to give this a meaningful name. So I'm going to just call this vertical gutters. Excellent. So I can go ahead and lock that, but really I don't really even need it anymore. I can hide it. What I want are these guidelines, which are now going to guide us in creating the vertical columns. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to click my rectangle tool here, and I'm going to adjust the color. In particular, I'm going to click here on the red color, and you can make it really any color you want. I'm going to click out of there, and then I'm going to make it quite transparent. So it's actually going to be almost see-through, but 10% transparency. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to drag and drop and create a rectangle. Importantly, what I want to do is position this rectangle so it's right up there in the upper left-hand corner, and I'm going to fix its width so that it's exactly between, let me zoom in here a little bit and pan over so it fits beautifully right in between those guidelines. Now, if I select this, I know I want it to fill the entire column. So in terms of height, I want this to be quite a bit longer than it already is. In fact, I know that this is 17 inches wide and 11 inches tall, but of those 11 inches, a half inch on the top and a half inch on the bottom are the margin. So really what I have are 10 inches to play with. And so if I do that and then zoom out, you can see I've got this vertical column exactly where I want it. It's taking up the entire height of our canvas within our specified margins. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this rectangle again, and I'm going to hold down my control key and just drag them one by one into position here. And you can see the reason we built those gutters was to simply get those guidelines just so we have a little bit of white space between each of these columns. All right, good. Now what I want to do, I'm going to zoom out a little bit more here, and let's center this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to select everything on the page, and I want to do a little bit of cleanup here, so just make sure they're all aligned to the top. And I'm going to zoom in a little bit further and just make sure everything snapped the way I thought it was. And you can see they're beautifully in place. Excellent. I'm going to select all of these again by drawing a box around them. I'm going to right click and click Group Selection. And again, you can see the layer collapsed, and I want to name this my vertical grid or columns. Excellent, and I can go ahead and lock that. Okay, very good. Now you can imagine we have our 12 columns going left to right. Now what we need to do is build our horizontal gutters followed by our horizontal grid. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to grab my shape tool here, and I want to go back to some other color. So I think I'm using a light gray. It doesn't really matter what it is, but something here. And I'm going to go ahead and shut off I'm going to lock this layer, and I'm going to shut off the visibility of my vertical grid because I don't want that to distract us while we're working. And now I have the same task that we did before when we created the gutters. So I need my shape tool selected, and I'm just going to drag and drop a rectangle like this. And again, we know what we want the height of this to be, which is 16 hundredths of an inch. So just like that, and then I want to line it right up there on the left margin. So my X value is 0.05 or is 0.5. And just like before, we need many of these, but before we do that, we want one that is going to be half the size of this. So I'm going to drag and drop one of those, and I'm going to resize the new one to be half of 1600ths, which is 800ths. And I'm going to drag it. Let's zoom in quite a bit here. And you can see I'm actually putting it outside the margin. And it's still lined up on my leftmost line here. And I'm going to drag and drop that because I want a copy of it. Of course, when I dragged and dropped, I held down the Alt key so I get a copy of it instead of just moving it. And I'm going to bring this one all the way down to the bottom like this. And I'm going to go ahead and zoom in so I get a nice close look at it. And excellent, because of snapping, it looks like it's just where it needs to be. It's at the X position of 0.5 and it's at 10.5 inches on my Y. So let me zoom out a bit. And previously, we made 12 columns, but we're only going to make 6 horizontal grid lines. So you can imagine we already have one here. So if I drag and drop, that's 2, that's the 3rd, that's the 4th, that's the 5th, and this is the 6th. So let's count them out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then this is 6. Of course, these are really uneven, so what I'm going to do is drag and drop to select them all. I want to make sure they're all aligned to the left. They should be. And actually, I can see by looking at this, they went a little bit too far out. So I'm going to manipulate them so that their X position is right on the edge. So I'm going to come here and type in, I want it to be 0.5 is the X position. Very good. And now with all of them selected, I want to get a nice even vertical distribution. So I'm going to come over here to the distribute vertically button and I'm going to click that, and boom, they're all going to be distributed vertically and evenly for me. Now what I can do is start adding my guidelines to define the gutters and the spaces between the gutters. So I'm going to come up to the horizontal, I'm going to drag this down, and I'm going to put it right on our top margin. But from there, I'm going to, let's come in a little bit here. From there, I'm going to start dragging and dropping and letting them snap to the shape itself, just like we did before. And thankfully, it's a little bit easier now because there's only 6 to do instead of 12. Excellent. And I'll pan up and click. Whoops, I forgot to select this. And just dragging and dropping those guidelines. Okay, very good. So I can zoom out now, and you can see this 12 by 6 grid is really just about done. It looks like I have one extra guideline here, so I'm just going to drag this over and drop it here on the ruler to make it go away. Very good. Now what I want to do, I'm going to select these shapes, and I'm going to come over here with them selected. I'm going to right click and say group selection, and these are my horizontal gutters. Oops, let me make that a capital G, and I'm going to go ahead and lock that, click out, lock the layer, and hide it. Because really all we're after are the guidelines themselves, which we measured out already. So again, just like we built our vertical grid, now we're going to build our horizontal grid. So again, I'm going to select the shape tool. I'm going to come over to my fill. I'm going to click bright red, and then I'm going to drop the transparency down to just 10%. And I'm just going to drag and drop like that. You can see automatically Gravette created a new layer for me for this shape to sit on. And as you might imagine, I'm going to drop it right up here so that it snaps beautifully right into the upper left-hand corner. And again, if I check my X and Y at location or position, I can see 0.5, 0.5. That's perfect. Now what I want to do is drag this. Let me zoom in a little bit. Zoom in one more, 2 more. Now what I'm going to do is drag this down to the very first guideline like that. And if I zoom out and pan, essentially I want this to fill the full width of my canvas. And so what I need to do is adjust the width of this. Right now it's a little over 4 inches, but I know that I actually want it to be 16 inches even. And you can see that it goes end to end except for our margin. And now what I'm going to do is just copy each of these. So I'm holding down my Alt key and dragging and dropping, and trying to carefully set those into place, dragging and dropping, dragging and dropping. Okay, very good. Now let's zoom in a little bit just to make sure everything landed where we think it did. And it looks like that's right on the margin, or right on the guidelines. This is right on the guidelines. Excellent, good. So now what I can do is zoom out. I'm going to select all 6 of these horizontal guides, and I'm going to right click and I'm going to say group. I'm going to call this my horizontal grid. In other words, my horizontal grid, which is my rows. And of course, I can lock that. Now, I am done, actually. I have created my grid. Now, if I want to see everything, I can come up to View. I can toggle Show Guidelines to make it go away. And what I have now is I'm currently showing my horizontal grid, but my vertical grid is turned off. So I want to toggle the visibility on. And boom, there you go. You have a nice, useful grid to help you line things up. Now, some of you may be wondering, how do I add this to a new page? Well, what you can do is you can go ahead and lock this and watch. I'm going to create a brand new page. Click. Page 3, this was just created, and you can see here it keeps some of the same settings. But one of the things you can do is apply a master to this new page. So if I drop this down, I see my other pages here as masters. So what I have here, I can select Grid New in my drop-down menu, and boom, I can't select this. That's just the master in the background. And what this can do is be really helpful so that it's there so you can reference it, but it's actually not anything you can click on or move. So there you have it, folks, a 12x6 grid to help you with your Wikipedia poster designs. Thanks, and hope you enjoyed the tutorial.